As Foreign Service officers, you are sample Americans. People abroad will think better or worse of the United States because of what you do.
The State Department had the well-deserved reputation of being extremely elitist.
It was pale male in Yale.
The fact of the matter was, they could never conceive that a black man could ever be an ambassador.
It's difficult to fully conceptualize what it meant to be black in the government during that time period.
These three diplomats represented progress, but it was an uphill battle.
He wanted his voice to be heard. He wanted a seat at the table.
I, Carl T. Rowe, do solemnly swear.
He was not simply going to push papers and have photo ops. He wanted to do things.
If one was an ambassador, there was a feeling that this man was a true representative of the country.
But which United States do they represent? The paragon of democracy, or the America that kept African Americans in second-class citizenship?
It is hard to do the work of America when you have been Jim Crowed by your own government.
Institutional culture wasn't going to change on its own. It was going to change by being confronted, by being embarrassed.
Sure, we're going to be criticized. It's because we're talking about the things that the United States stands for.
For diplomats, you're fighting America so that it can live up to what it says it is, while you're also fighting for America. That is no easy walk.
Good evening. I'm Rachel FLOR, Executive Director of the John F. Kennedy Library Foundation. On behalf of all of my library and foundation colleagues, I am so delighted to welcome all of you who are watching tonight's program online. To open, I humbly start with a land acknowledgement to recognize the Indigenous tribes of the Pawtucket and Massachusetts peoples of the Wampanoag Tribal Confederation territories, who both past and present and throughout many generations have stewarded the land where the Kennedy Library is today. While a land acknowledgement is not enough, it's an important way to promote Indigenous visibility, and it serves as a reminder that we are on stolen and settled Indigenous land. I invite all of us to contemplate how to better support Indigenous communities and to learn how to honor and take care of the land that each of us inhabits. I would also like to acknowledge the generous support of our underwriters of the Kennedy Library Forums, lead sponsors, Bank of America, the Lowell Institute and AT&T, and our media sponsors, the Boston Globe and WBUR. And we thank GBH and PBS's American Experience for their partnership in bringing this exciting preview of the American Diplomat to the library virtually this evening. We look forward to a robust question and answer period this evening. You'll see full instructions on screen for submitting your questions via email or comments on our YouTube page during the program. The American Diplomat spotlights three pioneering Black diplomats, Edward R. Dudley, Terrence Todman, and Carl Rowan, assigned to advocate for American ideals abroad while contending with racism at home. We are so pleased tonight to have the opportunity to explore their extraordinary work and legacy in more detail in tonight's preview and in the discussion that follows. I am delighted to welcome tonight's distinguished panelists to the library virtually. Ambassador Aurelia Brazeal retired from the U.S. Foreign Service in 2008 with the rank of career minister after a distinguished 40-year career. She was a pioneer in being the first to serve in a newly created position and is the first African-American woman career Foreign Service officer to be promoted in the senior Foreign Service and the first to be nominated as an ambassador. Leola Calzolai-Stewart is the director and producer of the American Diplomat. She brings over 15 years experience in documentary film and is co-founder of the Virginia-based production company, Flow State Films. She has also lived in the diplomatic world for 18 years, an experience that enriched her approach to the storytelling. The American Diplomat is Leola's directorial debut. Adriane Lentz-Smith is an associate professor and associate chair in Duke's Department of History, where she teaches courses on the Civil Rights Movement, Black Lives, Modern America, and History in Fact and Fiction. She is author of Freedom Struggles, African Americans, and World War I. And our moderator, Cameo George, is the executive producer of American Experience, PBS's longest running and most watched history series. We look forward to the conversation with our special guests following an extended preview of the American Diplomat, focusing on the stories of Ambassador Terrence Todman and Ambassador Carl Rowan. But first, I'm honored to introduce Ambassador Linda Thomas-Greenfield, the United States representative to the United Nations, and Pat Harrison, President and CEO of the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, to say a few words.
Thank you so much, Rachel, for that introduction. And thank you to the JFK Library, GBH Boston, and American Experience for hosting this preview. It's an honor to introduce The American Diplomat, a film that tells the stories of Edward R. Dudley, Terrence Todman, and Carl Rowan, 3 Black ambassadors who broke barriers, not just in the State Department, but for our country. When I first joined the Foreign Service in 1982, Terrence Todman was already a phenomenon. In those early days, I was too nervous to even talk to him. He was a living legend to us, and as far as I was concerned, he could have been the president. But his counsel and his example would prove to be invaluable. The same was true for Carl Rowan. He had already left the State Department by the time I arrived. He'd gone back to pursuing his prestigious career as a journalist. Fortunately, he returned to deliver a lecture to a group of young Black Foreign Service officers, including me, where I was able to glean his insights. Perhaps the biggest insight of all was simply seeing those giants pave the way. I felt this personally when I first arrived as ambassador to Liberia. As I walked into the U.S. Embassy, I was struck by the line of photos of previous ambassadors. There at the very beginning was Ambassador Edward R. Dudley. Visually, I could see how he forged a path for us. After him in the line of photos was a string of Black ambassadors, and now here I was, arriving as the first female ambassador to Liberia. As you'll hear in the film, Ambassador Dudley saw that the State Department was restricting the assignments of Black officers to African and Caribbean posts. He pushed back against that policy because he understood the breadth and depth of talent, expertise, and knowledge that Black officers brought to the world stage. By the time I arrived at the Foreign Service, I wanted to serve in Africa. I asked to serve in Africa. And thanks to the leadership of Dudley and so many others, that choice was determined by my passion and not by prejudice. The history of American diplomacy has been led by Black diplomats determined to make a difference. That includes female Black diplomats too, like Ambassadors Ruth Davis, Barbara Watson, Aurelia Brazeal, who were pioneers in their own right. I hope somebody makes a movie about them one day too, and just maybe I'll be included. These trailblazers and so many others understood a simple concept. Racial diversity is America's strength, not its weakness. It took hard work and the sacrifices of many great foreign and civil service officers and specialists before the State Department and the United States government embraced this powerful principle. Today we do. Every day I have the great privilege of sitting behind the United States placard and representing America to the United Nations. And with a diverse team behind me, I am better able to advocate for America's interests across the globe. So I hope you enjoy hearing and seeing the unvarnished stories of how these 3 men helped change the State Department and in turn our country and our world. And now I'm happy to turn it over to President and CEO of the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, Pat Harrison. Pat, over to you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you again for being here. I'm so excited to speak to our filmmaker, Leola Calzolai-Stewart, a real-life American diplomat, Ambassador Aurelia Brazeal, and historian Adriane Lentz-Smith about this wonderful, wonderful film. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the funders of this film, Liberty Mutual Insurance, the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, the estate of Marcia Feinhandler through the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, the Robert David Lyon Gardner Foundation, the Documentary Investment Group, PBS, GBH, and of course, viewers like you. Leola, I am going to start with you. I am so, so proud of this film and thrilled to have worked with you on your directorial debut. Can you tell us a little bit about the genesis of this film and how it came to be, how you discovered the story and what it took to bring it to life?
Yeah, so the story really came as a convergence of several things. One thing that was mentioned in the intros is that I've been a part of the Foreign Service world. My husband is a Black diplomat. We've actually been in the Foreign Service community, if I do the math, almost 20 years now. So it's been quite a while. And oftentimes in that experience, we've come to post and been one of the few families of color, one of the few Black families at post overseas. And so that starts to, start to ask questions why, want to dig a little deeper into why that's so. At the same time, my husband, over the course of his career would meet these incredible Black diplomats who would speak about their early days in the Foreign Service, people like Ruth Davis and Ambassador Brazeal, and how they came up through and navigated the Foreign Service. And he often thought that these were stories that not many people knew about, and worried that the details of these stories would pass away and not be known to the wider public. And he handed me this book called Black Diplomacy by Michael Krenn. And these three things together, I think, really served as a jumping off point to dive deeper into that history, to learn more about early diplomats, dive into these oral history archives. And I brought the idea to my partners at Flow State Film, my co-producing partners, Kylie Kriskowskis and Rochelle Shapiro. And they also thought it was a compelling piece of history to dive into. And we decided to tell these stories and develop them into a film.
Mm-hmm. And Ambassador Brazeal, as an ambassador and a career minister, watching this film, what strikes you the most about these men, their careers and their service? Does it resonate with you and your time in the Foreign Service?
It does. And what resonates with me most is that they were activists, both on the policy side as well as on the programmatic side in their countries, and that they always questioned conventional wisdom. They didn't settle for the status quo, and they tried to bring change to the State Department and Foreign Service systems. And they also met ordinary citizens of the country that they were in, and not just the officials in government. So those three things resonated with me because I tried to pursue those three items in my career. I benefited from the changes that they brought. So that one of the, I think Barbara Watson at the time, who was the first Black woman equivalent of an assistant secretary at the State Department, met with a few of us when we came in, a few Black officers, and suggested that we should be worldwide available, not just the Negro circuit. So that I didn't come to Africa until late in my career, because of that admonition to be worldwide available. So I could see reflected in many things that happened to me what these three ambassadors had worked on in terms of issues to change both internally in the State Department as well as representing the United States overseas.
Mm-hmm. And Ambassador, this question is to you, but really actually it's for all of our panelists. Why was it important to be worldwide available, and what do we gain from having Black diplomats, Black Foreign Service officers available to be stationed anywhere? What is so special about or important about bringing that diversity to the Corps?
Well, I think we've heard that diversity is America's strength, and it brings the diversity in the Foreign Service now brings new voices to the table when you're trying to formulate policy, as well as when you're trying to practice diplomacy. So that you need these voices because it challenges that conventional thinking, it challenges groupthink, it gives you more options, it gives you a different perspective. And how do you have that because of our own experience in this country? Frankly, in my view, in the 21st century and the position that the United States currently has in the world, which has been weakened, it seems to me in my over the past 4 or 5 years of our internal situation here in the US, American diplomats are going to have to register the fact that now we're just one among many voices in the world speaking on issues, and they're going to have to adjust. We already know how to be a minority, and so we're comfortable with that, I think, as a Black diplomat.
Mm-hmm. I didn't know if anyone else was going to add to that.
Well, I think Ambassador Brazeal said it best. I think, I also, I think diplomats also bring lived experience to their work. And so to have a diversity in that lived experience, to be able to connect with other people and other cultures on different levels and in more nuanced ways, I think strengthens the Foreign Service and strengthens American diplomacy. And to create a more inclusive Foreign Service is part of creating that more nuanced American diplomacy, I think.
And I think the point that the ambassadors in the film were trying to make also holds true, which is it's a planet filled with people, various peoples, of hues, backgrounds, experiences, what have you. And so to be able to communicate, to represent America as being as varied and heterogeneous as the globe itself actually makes the nation seem more appealing, more open, right? It's having a diverse Foreign Service also says, as again, the diplomats in the documentary said, white supremacy is not going to be our national project going forward.
And so in tonight's clip, we learned about Terrence Todman and Carl Rowan, but when our viewers get an opportunity to watch the full film on Tuesday night on PBS or on our website, americanexperience.org, they'll meet the first African-American ambassador, Edward Dudley. In addition to being the first, why was his service so important and so impactful? Adriane, can you talk a little bit about that, and then maybe Leola as well?
Sure, I'll talk for a minute, and then Leola can jump in and correct me because she, this is her area of expertise. So Edward Dudley mattered because he was the first, and because he changed what service meant for everyone. He was assigned, he was sent to Liberia, he was elevated to the position of ambassador, and he looked around and said, all of the staff here, all of the Black people on staff here have remained in a very narrow circuit, right? They have only been to the handful of places that are comfortable for the administration, comfortably Black countries, right? They're not sending them to Europe. They're not sending them to places with mostly or majority white people. And Edward Dudley was he was a lawyer by training, right? He'd come out of the NAACP's legal wing. And he said, to paraphrase Terrence Todman later, like, I don't have a problem. You have a problem. You're breaking the law. And what I'm going to do is offer you the opportunity to fix yourself, right? And so he pushed the State Department to begin assigning people broadly. People on his staff suddenly were going to Paris or elsewhere, places that they'd never been before. And to track back to our answer to the last question, it allowed the US to represent itself in something more akin to the fullness of the population. Not totally, there's still very many limits and not enough people, but it was an opening, right? He cracked something open.
I can't add anything to that. I mean, Adriane, said it very well. Edward R. Dudley, he saw a morale problem and used his skills as a lawyer very strategically to quietly but effectively try to enact some change. And, as Adriane said, soon after, people that were posted in Liberia were sent to Paris, Switzerland, and Rome. And, that opened that door just a little bit wider for Black diplomats to break free of that Negro circuit, as it was called.
Mm-hmm. And Leola, you've shared with us that you live this life as a diplomatic spouse, and you and your husband have benefited from breaking open this Negro circuit. Can you just a little personal information? Can you share with us some of the places that you've been stationed?
Sure. I really appreciated Ambassador Linda Thomas-Greenfield's opening statements, because our first post was one that we chose. It was our number one. When you go into the A100 class, you have to list, like your top three. I can't remember if it was top 3 or top 5 or something like that. And number 1 on our list was Mali. And so we served, my husband served in Mali for 2 years. That was his first posting. We were in South Africa, came back to DC for a while. We were in Belgium, Brazil, and now Canada.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But I love that you talked about Mali and then South Africa being your choices, and Ambassador Thomas-Greenfield spoke about it as well. It's the beauty of having the option. It's not saying that you don't want to go to these places, but just that you want to have the option, as Ambassador Brazeal said, being worldwide available. Like, that is the real beauty to me of what we learned about Edward R. Dudley in this film. So I appreciate that. I have more questions for you, but I'm also starting to get questions from the audience. So I'm actually going to jump to the first audience question. And it is, how did the US and its diplomats view African nationalism for independence, which paralleled the African-American struggle for freedom and equality?
Well, I'll just say very quickly, because I see Ambassador Brazeal has a comment. I think, for example, Terrence Todman saw the struggle as very similar. I mean, he knew that the future of Africa was Africa, wasn't colonial leadership. And I think he used every opportunity that he could to make that clear, that the US needed to start recognizing African independence movements as the future, and that colonial powers were no longer the experts on these countries. And something that I thought was very interesting that Adriane pointed out early on in our discussions about Terence Todman was that who better would understand that than someone who had grown up in the US Virgin Islands, who understood this idea of American imperialism too, and understood the importance of independence. And so I think for someone like Terence Todman, he really understood that the future of Africa was independence. But I know Ambassador Brazeal had a comment as well.
Well, I was going to jump in, and it's maybe almost a pitch for diverse people to think of the Foreign Service as a career. But what excited me was Ralph Bunche. If we remember, Ralph Bunche served at the United Nations, an American Black diplomat, and he was instrumental in setting up what was called the Council in the United Nations, where colonial powers had to report every year what they were doing with their colonial countries in terms of setting them on the path to independence. That was monumental. The setting as a diplomat, as a Black diplomat, the setting up of this anti-colonial conference in the United Nations led to the demise of colonialism. Just a simple fact of thinking to set up this committee where people had to report. So I've seen in my life Black diplomats like Ralph Bunche, and then Edward Dudley and Terence Todman and Paul Rowan and others, through their policy ideas, set up the groundwork where countries become independent of themselves, and US policy can become independent of the colonial powers' view of what is happening. And you get that thread throughout our history in the 20th century. And to me, that was exciting. And one of the reasons I thought of the Foreign Service as a career was what these people were able to do policy-wise.
Yeah, so the thing to underscore there is that it's not just perspectives, it's practices, it's policies and practices, right? And the presence of folks, the practices matter, because what they also do is provide different ways in or different ways of reacting than might happen otherwise. So if we think again to this period that the question asked about, the civil rights era, which is also the Cold War, which is also the era of decolonization, right? But the inclination of the administrations, particularly if we start an early Cold War, early-ish Cold War with Eisenhower and such, is to see the push for decolonization or African nationalism or Pan-Africanism as communist inspired, right? As if people didn't have some reason to want independence, that would be generated from them. In the same way that in the South, the defenders of Jim Crow would talk about outside agitators, as if Black Southerners didn't understand what they didn't have and didn't want it themselves, right? So there's sort of like lazy but dogmatic applications of their ways of thinking, that having Black folks in place, having the sort of like grand sort of policy minds like Ralph Bunche could disrupt, right, and counter.
And we're all talking about one of the things that we're talking about and that we see in this film that's so interesting is this ability to change from the inside, right? Like there are moments for each of these three men where you can imagine them questioning, why am I here? I'm banging my head against the wall. I believe in this great project, and I believe in my presence here, and I believe in my own abilities. But it's hard because not everyone that I work with, not everyone that I'm interacting with believes in me and believes in my being here in the same way. Can we talk a little bit about that conflict and what it must have been like to have a foot in both worlds?
W.E.B. Du Bois, the double consciousness. I think, as I tried to suggest, African Americans know how to be a minority, and we have coping skills for that. Our white fellow citizens sometimes don't have those coping skills. They don't know what to do. But in the 20th century, I think one of the positives was that we had our domestic politics stopping at the water's edge. That was how people approached foreign policy. Our leaders, elected leaders, both at the national and local levels, basically our politics stopped at the water's edge, and so that there was a consistency to our foreign policy that was, I think, welcomed, because you could see the through line of the civil rights era loosening things up, and we were becoming more inclusive, and we could talk to foreign countries about that inclusivity. One of the things I try to do as a diplomat is to always keep the United States relevant. And to be relevant, we have to reflect the changes that are ongoing in this society. And in the 21st century, our politics no longer stop at the water's edge, seemingly. And it's going to be much more difficult, I think, to keep the United States relevant because we don't have that consistency necessarily in our foreign policy worldwide.
So, Ambassador Brazeal, you said in the film something that I wrote down and will repeat in classes, where you said the currency of diplomacy is optimism, right? So part of the answer is that these were people who believed that they could do something that mattered, and they had to have that optimism, or they wouldn't have taken on what was, on the face of it, an impossible task. I'm also struck by the fact that at least with Todman and Rowan, and I suspect this is true of Dudley, what comes across is that these are men with tremendous senses of themselves, their capability, and their consequence. And that is both armor and fuel for the task that they had before them. And then I think the other part of it, and I think where the context of the civil rights movement helps them, if we're going to link back to the earlier question, is that here they are working from the inside, and they can say to the administrations that they serve, here we are giving you the opportunity to represent the US and what it might mean, and perhaps does mean, to the world. And if you don't use us, rest assured, civil rights activists, SNCC has a certain kind of internationalism. There have been long-standing, right, from the AME Church to what's left of the Garveyites to sort of nascent Black Power, which will, in the form of the Panthers or the Nation of Islam. There are all of these Black folks out and about, sort of organized or not, who are doing internationalist work that will link Americans to people in the broader world. And so having insiders in place is a way of being able to set the message and the agenda, sometimes in concert with those other activists and sometimes in competition with them.
I think also what's interesting about the three characters too, and as another distinguishing factor, is that two of them were political appointees. So you had Edward R. Dudley and Carl Rowan that were politically appointed, which, in many ways is, eventually their time would be up in the State Department when the administration changes. But Terrence Todman, when you talk about institutional change, is a career diplomat, someone who, as you said, had a very strong sense of self, I think, and what he could add to diplomacy, and I think really believed in the mission of diplomacy. And as a result, I think career diplomats see the value of staying in institutions to continue to sort of chip away at this and continue to try to create a more inclusive space, and see it as a long-term like dedication and career. And I know Ambassador Brazeal is also a career diplomat. So, she's dedicated her career to also doing the same.
I think we become comfortable with what I call ambiguity, and that is that you could work on an issue or a policy and not see anything happen until 5 years later, because you're really trying to influence. If you're influencing a country, you're really influencing people, and people change very slowly. So you don't just parachute in and expect something to happen immediately, although Americans have a very short timeline, but most countries have a longer timeline. So it's that comfort factor that you are working on something worthwhile and may not bloom until later, but you have that optimism that something will happen, something good.
And so I do have questions from the audience rolling in, so please continue to submit your questions. But before I turn to one of the audience questions, we're having a conversation right now about the difference between being a political appointee and a career diplomat. And I'm wondering if, Adriane, if you could talk to us a little bit about how the priorities and ideologies of different presidents changed the course of our protagonists' careers.
Sure. So for all three of the protagonists in this film, we're in a Cold War that is kind of coalescing, intensifying, and then with Johnson, you could say, going haywire, right? And that's the context in which all of the presidents are making their decision. And so the context in which our protagonists are maneuvering, right? And there's like different things that each of them can do. In the case of Edward Dudley, the first, who's not in the snippet, what will be when you all watch it on the 15th, Dudley, I mean, and I should say none of the presidents are like, kind of racial groundbreakers devoid of kind of racist inclinations or feelings, right? They are white men raised in the early 20th century with certain understandings of whiteness and blackness and capacity and what have you. But they have different responses over time to those. So with Truman, he really sees in the aftermath of a war against fascism, right, which embraces white supremacy as part of it, in the beginning of a Cold War when the legitimacy of American democracy is on the line, he comes to see baby steps towards opening up, towards desegregating things as being part of the mission, right? So Dudley is in place precisely because of Truman's sort of changing ideology and how he thinks it necessary to fight the Cold War. Eisenhower is actually far more recalcitrant. He does not want to push for civil rights to disrupt his prosecution of the Cold War. And he does not initially see fighting the Cold War and equal rights or not even equal rights, some rights for African Americans as being part of the same struggle. As we see with the coverage of Little Rock, he sat on that for weeks before he did anything, right? And there's a similar kind of closedness to decolonizing that's reflected. His lack of receptivity to civil rights is similar to his lack of receptivity to decolonizing nations, which means that Todman is moving through slightly different space. By the time we get to Rowan and Kennedy and the ways in which the US must deal with the sort of pressing questions of that the civil rights movement have made urgent in order to have any kind of legitimate standing in presenting itself to the world as a counter to the Soviet Union, right? Like Rowan is differently placed, has tremendous opportunities because of this urgency, and also knows how to do stuff within those opportunities.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I have a question from the audience. Let's see. How do you deal with the dilemma of whether to continue or resign when you find American policy immoral? Perhaps we can talk about examples from the film. I won't put Ambassador Brazeal on the spot. Maybe you want to talk about it in general terms or tie it to our protagonists in this particular film.
Well, the Foreign Service and the State Department has a certain, at least when I was again in the 20th and the first part of the 21st century, it has a certain tolerance for dissent. And so, and this came through the Vietnam War era when I first came in particular, they realized they had to create a way for people to internally dissent, and then they would answer that dissent. So there is a certain tolerance in the culture for dissent, number one. Number two, I usually tell people you have to develop your own personal continuum. And on one side of the continuum is acquiescence to whatever policy is in place and not questioning it. And at the other end might be resignation. And then you find where you are comfortable on that continuum personally. Perhaps you disagree with a policy, and so you decide not to work in that part of the world where that policy is being applied. That's one option, as short of resignation. So you have to sort of personally become comfortable where you want to be on that continuum and maybe resign. I had colleagues who did resign over the Vietnam War at the time, soon after we had come into the Foreign Service. So I've met people in many places on that continuum. But back to the optimistic point of view too, it's not always either or. Diplomats look for the and also, or part of the equation, and not see things so much as either or, and you fix your positions in that way. You have to look for the and also maneuverability to push things in the direction that you think they should go.
I think in terms of the film too, it's, as I had mentioned before with Ambassadors Dudley and Rowan, Dudley resigns, but it wasn't an unexpected resignation. I mean, it was a change in administration, and he knew his time was coming to an end. But Carl Rowan, I think, while he didn't disagree with the Vietnam War, he disagreed with how it was being, how it was unfolding. He disagreed with the secretiveness around how it was being conducted, and eventually I think becomes a bit disillusioned with the administration and how it was being run. And so when he resigns from USIA, I think it really is a moment of, I don't really want to be a part of this right anymore, and it goes back into journalism. So I Terrence Todman has a long career, 40 some years. So for him, he found that his spot on that continuum that Ambassador Brazeal has mentioned.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. I have a question from the audience for Ambassador Brazeal. What do you think the State Department can do now in the current moment to build a more just, equitable, and inclusive workforce?
I think it can do more of what it's beginning to do now. We have Ambassador Gina Abercrombie Winstanley, who is the first Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer in the State Department, and she and her team, I think, are building in the expertise not only in her office but in each bureau of people responsible for this. She's institutionalizing the annual performance evaluation to make sure that people before they're promoted have to be rated somehow or having a write-up done of what they've done for inclusion, equity, and justice, so that there's some meat being put on the bones. In my experience, you had allies in the State Department very interested in increasing diversity, but these were individuals, and you didn't really get to a point of touching the structure that was built in that prevented. You were sort of almost going individual by individual, which can be very frustrating. So now I think the structure itself is being looked at in a way that's going to change, and I welcome that. I also think that we have more diversity in the sense of racial diversity, gender diversity, educational diversity, other kinds of diversity, so that we are getting people, new second generation immigrants, for example, coming into the Foreign Service, who are going to offer their own perspective. And that's exciting. But we still, in my view, historically must look at the African-American contribution and increase the numbers of African-Americans, because after all, that's one of the founding sins of the country, is the Black-white issue. And that always has to be addressed in a particular way, in my view.
Leola, I'm curious, how has your experience changed over the course of 20 years being a Black family in the diplomatic corps? Have you seen changes in how you're received when you land at different posts, or when you talk about your experience being a diplomatic family?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely been change in the last 20 years. I just agree with Ambassador Brazeal, though I think there's still a lot of work to be done. I think it is nice and heartening to see when we go to different posts an increased number of people of color, an increased number of LGBTQ representation as well, which is great. But it's, as Dr. Kren says in the film, I think as this history has shown, it's been a bit of an uphill battle. And so, there's still quite a bit of work to be done. And I think with the new Officer of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, I think it is pretty hopeful and signals a change in the department that I hope will show a shift in how these issues are addressed and how conversations are had, and sparking the new conversations on these issues as well.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. One of the things that we got to see last week was the dedication of the cafeteria at the Foreign Service to Terrence Todman. Leola, can you talk a little bit about just how that happens and what that means to Terrence Todman, to his family, and to African-American members of the service to this day?
Yeah, it was a great panel. There was a panel of myself and Terrence Todman Jr., Ambassador Todman's son, Ambassador Abercrombie Winstanley, and Miriam Safi, who's with the Office of DEI at the Department of State. And in the morning, it was a wonderful panel that celebrated the life and legacy of Terrence Todman and his contributions to American diplomacy and the State Department. And then later that day, there was a ceremony at the State Department's cafeteria that they renamed in honor of Terrence Todman and the his efforts to desegregate the Foreign Service Institute eating facilities. And I think in general, it just feels great, I think, to be seen. I think for Black diplomats in the department, this history acknowledged, this history recognized. it was wonderful to see the Secretary of State give comments about this history and acknowledge it, the contributions of not just Terrence Todman, but other diplomats, to other Black diplomats to the Department of State. So I think it was meaningful for his family. His son spoke very eloquently about his father and his father's career, his mother, and her participation in this, diplomatic endeavor, which I think is also a family project when you go overseas. So I think it was a meaningful moment. And I know for someone like myself and my husband, it was nice to see this history acknowledged and to be seen, I think, in the Department of State.
Mm-hmm. There's an amazing anecdote in the film about Ambassador Todman trying to, or advocating for desegregating the cafeteria. So it's especially resonant and poignant that this dedication happened this month. And I'd like to think that that your work in putting together this film raised his profile even further and contributed to this honor as well.
I saw, if I could, I saw comments from Foreign Service officers after the dedication, and some people also seeing this film somewhat early, to say they didn't know this history, and so unfortunately, it's reflective of this American tendency to try to deny facts and true American history. So these kinds of stories have to be told, I think, and have to be told to the Foreign Service officers who reflect American society, which doesn't know the stories of African Americans and their contribution to this country.
We only have a couple of minutes left, and so I'd love to go down the list and just ask each of you what you hope that people will take away from learning this history from this film, but also further readings that they do. Ambassador, if I can start with you.
Well, thank you. I hope that people who watch the film will think of coming into the Foreign Service as a career. All people who watch the film, because we still need a rainbow representation of this country, and that they get excited about the possibilities of what they can do as an American diplomat in representing our country. You're not, as it was said in the film, it's the good, the bad, and the ugly. You don't lie about what's going on in this country, but to me, you use what's going on as a way to keep the United States relevant, because most countries have similar kinds of problems, maybe not exactly the same, but the similarity. So we can talk about common ground. And so I hope people think of diplomacy as worthwhile and diplomats as necessary.
Thank you. Adriane?
I would want people to take away a sense that America is a project, right? Perpetual project, always ongoing, and that it takes the work of all of us to make the American state and the American nation, and our visions of what matters and who matters actually shapes America, and we should keep working on that. As always, I also want people to take away a sense that history is profoundly important and that there is far more to know than that we know. And I'll put in a plug on that note for the Office of the Historian at the State Department, which is a wonderful resource for learning the history of the State Department, but also of American foreign policy in general.
Thank you. And Leola Calzolai-Stewart, our director, I will give you the last word.
And just to quickly pick up on something that Adriane said about the Office of the Historian, there's also a wonderful organization based in the DC area, the Association for Diplomatic Studies and Training. They have an oral history archive of diplomats. And that is a beautiful thing to dive into and hear from diplomats themselves, what they've experienced and their histories. I think for me, what I hope people take away from the film is opening up this world of diplomacy. I think it is a quiet, behind the scenes type of job that not many people are aware of. And I want, I hope the film opens that world up to viewers. And I hope young viewers of color watch this and see that, these were trailblazers that paved a pathway for us to have a voice in American diplomacy, that it's not a job for privileged few, that there's a space there for us, that we can add our voices to how our country is represented overseas. And here are just a handful of people that helped create that space. So I hope that it does inspire a deeper dive into the Foreign Service and this history for younger viewers.
Beautifully said. So everyone, thank you so much for joining us. The American Diplomat airs next Tuesday, February 15th, 9 p.m. Eastern, 8 p.m. Central on PBS, on the PBS video app, or on our site, americanexperience.org. Again, I want to thank you all for joining us, for watching this excerpt, and then for staying for the panel. Ambassador Aurelia Brazeal, Professor Adriane Lentz-Smith, Director Leola Calzolai-Stewart, thank you so much for your time tonight. This was wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Cameo.